Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and I am so happy you guys are here today listening to our newest episode. If you are new here to the channel, be sure you like and subscribe because we love talking about these spooky, scary, evil people. But if this is not a new episode, well, it's a new episode for most people, but if you are not new here, if you've been following along and listening to all of my episodes, thank you so much for your support. I love doing this, and I love knowing that other people are enjoying what I'm doing. So thanks so much for tuning in. And be sure everyone is liking, subscribing, and of course, sharing the love with everybody else, right? Got to share these murderous stories. So also, I want to remind you, if you have any suggestions of people that you want to hear about, I would love to talk about those people for you. So you can tell me who you would like to hear about. Just message me on Instagram. It's Horrible Humans in History. And I also post pictures of the people that I'm talking about or the situations so you can have a better visual of what I'm talking about. I try not to put anything too gruesome on there, just so you know. But today, sorry I've been delaying it. Let's get into this. Today, we are going to be talking about one of Japan's most notorious women serial killers. She was known as the demon midwife. And I tell you what, as I did the research for this woman, there is not a lot of information. So this episode might be a little shorter than you're used to, but it's because she's super mysterious. There is not a ton of information about her, but she is the most notorious serial killer in Japan. So it's very interesting because, like I said, there's not a lot of information about her, but we will tell you her story. And by we, I mean me, your host, Angela. So let's get into this. Let's talk about the demon midwife. The demon midwife. Well, she has a name. And just so you know, this is in Japan, so I am going to do my best to pronounce all the names as correctly as possible. So if you know how to speak Japanese, I apologize ahead of time. I'm probably going to butcher these names, but to be fair, I butcher every name. So, so today we are talking about Miyuki Ishikawa. She was born February 5th, 1897 in the village of Honjo in Miyazaki Prefecture. So back in 1897, when she was born, we didn't actually get to know a lot about her. We don't know her parents' name. We don't know how she grew up. We really don't know a lot about her. The most recent record, earliest record besides her birth that we have is that in 1914, she moved to Tokyo, and she actually graduated from the University of Tokyo as a midwife on September 30th, 1919. So she was in school for a few years, and like I said, she's super mysterious. We don't know what she was doing during that time besides going to school. And if you recognize the date, 1914, keep that in mind. That's a very important time period that she is living. If you don't know, I'll explain in a minute. So around the same time that she actually graduated from the University of Tokyo, she got married to Takashi Ishikawa, and he was actually 3 years older than her, so they were pretty close in age. And he was originally from Ibaraki Prefecture. Sorry, guys. I am not great with names. So Takashi was a former Kempentai sergeant and a police officer. And he actually didn't have a super regular job and would often help his wife in her midwifery to kind of help her out and earn money because he didn't have a typical regular job. So it's unclear in many of the sources. It's very unclear why the couple did not have kids. There's a lot of mixed information. Some sources say it's because Miyuki had a hysterectomy, so she was unable to have children. Some of it just said that no one really knows why they didn't have children. Some say they had no children at all. Some say that they actually adopted 3 children and raised a son from Takashi's first marriage. But again, every single source, guys, she's super mysterious, but every source said something a little bit different. So they either had adopted children, 3 of them, 2 boys and 1 girl, or they raised a son from his previous marriage, or they had 0 children. And we don't know why, or she got a history. It's very, very unclear. So keep in mind, it is believed she had no children. So we're going to go with that story for the sake of our story today. So Miyuki was a very experienced midwife. She really had passion for it, and she put a lot of hard work into it. And she actually moved up through the ranks pretty quickly in midwifery. She actually managed a maternity home named Kotobuki Senin, holding some really important positions in multiple different midwives associations. So she was really good at what she did, and she really invested in it and put her whole heart and soul into it. Now, in April 1947, she actually ran in the election of Shinjuku's ward's assembly members, but was unsuccessful, didn't actually make what she was running for. But after getting enough experience, she was actually appointed as the hospital director of Kotobuku Maternity Hospital. So at this point in the story, I feel like we need to pause and talk a little bit about Japan itself and where Japan was in this point in history. So those of you who are history buffs probably noticed some dates in here that seem close to other really important dates. Those of you who aren't history buffs, let me explain. So, August 6th and August 9th are 2 very important days in 1945 that happened in Japan. If you're not familiar with history and dates, 1945 is when World War II ended. August 6th and August 9th were the days that the bombs were dropped on Japan. So, these bombs being dropped on Japan ended something that you've probably heard of called World War II. So, kind of important. So, Miyuki is living in post-war Japan. And now, I'm not here to debate the morality of the dropping of the bombs, so we're not even going to go there, and we're going to move past that really quick and talk about the reason why I'm bringing that up, why I'm bringing up the war and the dropping of the bombs. It's because it's very important to this story and obviously important to the people of Japan, right? It was a big part of what happened after the war ended. So they were still trying to rebuild. Their big cities were destroyed. Their economy was in the toilet because they had just tried to conquer most of Asia and had failed and had been pushed back and basically destroyed at this point. So their economy basically didn't exist. So unlike now, Japan was not a bustling, technologically advanced country. Now they're doing really, really well and thriving, especially in their technology sector. But at this point, they had not even gone that route. Many of the citizens were very, very poor, living in basically straw houses and farmers. So this war was devastating to them. So it's really important to note where Japan was at this point in history, because, like I said, it deeply impacts this story to know that economically, everyone was struggling. Everyone was having a hard time just feeding themselves. So keep that in mind as we continue with our story about Miyuki. So starting in the mid to late 1940s, during this post-war period of rebuilding their country, there were many, many babies being born out of wedlock, and their mothers were way too impoverished to properly raise a child, especially on their own. So, due to a decrease in foster parents, many of these babies were actually kept in Miyuki's hospital called Kotobuki Sanin. See, I keep trying to say it and I keep saying it wrong. With the dire financial situation of the country, many people stopped adopting and fostering children. So they literally were just abandoned at this hospital. And the hospital had an abundance of babies that they didn't know how to take care of. So in April 1944, Miyuki would find a solution to this problem, one that will sound all too familiar if you have listened to any of my past episodes. One specifically. It'll come to you. It's going to sound really familiar. So Miyuki began to think, which apparently was a very dangerous thing, especially if you were an abandoned baby in her hospital. She started thinking, if the baby is going to grow up poor and have a hard life, why bother letting it live? There's no point, because they're just going to be miserable. So when she would notice the parents would come in and they seemed to be in the middle of financial struggles, or if it was a single woman or anyone that didn't seem to her like they would want to care for a child, she would, quote unquote, help those parents out by getting rid of their quote unquote problem. So she would offer to take the baby and care for it in her hospital. Now, by caring for it, what she actually meant was, I will probably stick it in a corner, let it cry until it stops crying, and eventually dies. That's what she meant. Now, this part is so sad to me, because she did not kill these babies. I guess if you're being super technical, she didn't actually kill them like our friend Amelia Dyer. Remember how she would just strangle the babies, kill them pretty quick? Yeah, no. Miyuki did not do this. She literally, like I said, would put them in the corner. She wouldn't feed them. She wouldn't give them water. She wouldn't pay attention to them or anything. She just let them be. So she would just let them cry and cry and cry. And then just before they died, what happens is babies cry when they need things, right? And if they realize that no one's actually coming to help them, they will stop crying. And they stop crying just before they die. How heartbreaking is that? Like, it was a sign that the baby was about to die when suddenly, they would just calm down and seem super calm and be totally fine. And then they would die. Like, that just hurts my heart. And that's how she chose to kill them, was just abandoning them. I almost wish that she would have actually killed them in a different way. this is probably one of the worst things you could do to an innocent baby. Just like leave it and let it die on its own. Like Amelia Dyer almost was kinder by killing them quickly. Like, oh, it's just so sad. So, anyways, she would just leave these babies, abandon them. And this is the part of the story that literally blows my mind. Miyuki was not doing these murders in secret. No. Everyone who worked there knew about this. All of the midwives that worked for her were aware that this was happening. Are you kidding me? All the midwives knew. And some of them, well, all of them were super appalled at this practice. And many of them would actually leave her employment in protest of the killing of the innocent babies. And I get the ones that stayed, like, especially in this horrible economic time that they were having. They needed a job. They needed to feed their own families. But the crazier thing about this is that none of them actually went to the authorities to report what was happening. The most they did was leave her employment because they couldn't handle it. No one said anything to the police. No one. But it gets crazier because the authorities actually knew what was happening. Like, it's nuts. The authorities, the government was aware there was something going on because the hospital had an infant mortality rate that was ridiculous compared to all the other hospitals around. So they knew that something was going on there, but they didn't investigate. They did nothing. They just let it be. But soon, Miyuki would have a change of heart, right? As all of our horrible humans in history tend to do. You just have this change of heart where instead of doing this horrible evil deed for charity, you know, the charity of killing off people's babies for free, why not start making money off of it? That was her change of heart. She decided, you know what? I could actually charge people for this. I'm going to start charging people for this. So with the help of her husband, Miyuki started going door to door, talking to parents, especially newborn babies. Her victims were brand new babies. And she would talk to the parents like she was doing a sales pitch. Basically like, you know, see this little child you have in your arms? You could pay me blah, blah, blah yen. And then the child would be gone. You wouldn't have to pay to raise them. That's a bargain compared to what you would pay to raise this child. You just give me that much money, I will take them off your hands and you will be financially secure. And that sales pitch worked. Many parents, especially a lot of single women, paid her to get rid of their babies for them so they wouldn't have to raise a child. So why pay to raise a child when you can just have her dispose of this human life? So her and her husband established this business. Well, they even got help from a doctor. Dr. Shiro Nakayama would actually produce false death certificates for the infants that were killed. So they could present them to the government that it said that these babies died of natural causes. It was totally normal that these babies died. So they had a doctor on their side that they were paying out to get these fake death certificates. Now, they had a pretty slick business going on. Like, they were making quite a bit of money doing this. That is until January 12th, 1948. The remains of 5 infants were discovered by 2 police officers of Waseda, the Waseda precinct in Tokyo, and they discovered these infants' bodies by accident. So these guys had this super slick operation going on, making all kinds of money, killing off people's babies. And the only reason they were caught is because police officers happened to accidentally stumble upon a couple of the babies' bodies. So, after the police found these bodies, they ended up doing an autopsy, and it was discovered that the infants didn't actually die due to natural causes. And this finally sparked some suspicion. It's about freaking time. So an investigation was launched, and the clues quickly led the police straight to Miyuki Ishikawa and her husband and their doctor friend. After their arrests, a search encompassed the whole city because they were trying to find for sure how many babies had been killed. And 40 bodies of infants were found in a mortician's house, so working on disposing of them, and 30 more were discovered underneath a temple. There were actually still 7 surviving infants at Kotobuku Sanin, the hospital she worked at that point, but 2 of them died pretty soon after the police had found them and found the surviving children. There was never an official number of how many babies Miyuki actually killed, because after they started finding so many bodies, they kind of gave up searching. I've noticed that happens quite a bit when there's a serial killer that's super prolific, is at some point they're just like, well, there's a lot. There's just a lot. Well, it's believed that Miyuki killed around 103 to 169 babies. That's a lot of babies. And on January 15th, 1948, Miyuki, her husband, and the doctor were officially arrested and charged. So get this. This part absolutely blew my mind. There are so many parts of this story that are just mind-blowing, right? No one reporting it, like just deciding, hey, we can make some money off of this, and parents being like, yeah, I like that idea. Here you go. But this part, when she went to trial, this was Miyuki's defense. She deflected all blame of the infants' deaths, saying that it wasn't actually her fault, but it was the parents' fault. They were the ones to blame. They were the ones responsible for the death of their own infants. Why? Because they had abandoned their child, or they had given her the child to dispose of. Like, it wasn't her fault that they did it. It was all the parents. And you know what? It gets even crazier, because a large part of the public supported her in that defense. Most of the people of the country were like, well, yeah, that's legitimate. It was their kid. Like, it's not her fault they wanted the child dead. So she shouldn't be held to blame for the child's death, even though she was the one who killed it. Most of the population supported her in this defense claim. So I think it's important at this point in the story to point out that there are cultural differences in other countries, obviously. There are also differences in culture and beliefs and morals in other time periods in history. We can't really make judgments on people in history based off of our morality. We can't make judgments on people in other countries based off of our morality. No matter where we're from, our morality is going to be different than someone else's, especially during times and places. So I am not here to argue morality or one side or the other of any of these issues. I'm just giving you the facts, okay? Okay? So just remember that in Japan at this time, there were no laws that gave rights to infants. Babies had no rights. So it wasn't crazy that no one really pursued or felt issue with the fact that she had killed so many babies, because at that time, there wasn't really any protection for babies. So just keep that in mind when I continue to explain how the public majority of the population actually supported Miyuki. So Miyuki was actually sentenced to 8 years in prison for her crimes. She was charged with 3 of the murders, but that wasn't the biggest concern that people had. The biggest concern and the thing that bothered people the most was not the murder of the innocent babies. No. It was for charging people too much money to kill their babies. That was the bigger concern. So she was sent to prison for those crimes, basically not extortion, what's stealing from people, I guess, and killing babies. And the courts actually decided that her murders were murders of omission. Like, she wasn't actually at fault, but she did steal money from innocent parents that had nowhere left to turn. That's more of what their issue was. So later, Miyuki and her husband, so her husband was also sentenced. He and the doctor were both able to, they were both sentenced to 4 years imprisonment each. So they both spent 4 years in prison. Well, they didn't spend 4 years in prison. I take that back. The doctor spent 4 years in prison, but Miyuki and her husband were both able to get their sentences cut in half. So her husband only served about 2 years, and Miyuki served about 4 years. So they won that through an appeal in 1952. And in 1969, Ishikawa, so Miyuki Ishikawa to be specific, was interviewed by Shokan Shinko magazine. And she pled her innocence in the murders of the babies. She claimed that she had no responsibility. It was all the parents. So she kept her story the same, that she was not complicit in those murders. It wasn't her fault, basically. And when she was actually released from prison, she began to work selling soap and cream and fish. And at the time of the interview of the magazine, her husband had actually already passed away, and the doctor was operating a real estate office in Tokyo and doing fairly well for themselves. So no one actually knows what happened to Miyuki. It had her address listed for a while, and then it just kind of vanished. Some of the sources say that she died on May 30th in 1987, but most of the other sources that I was able to dig up, there wasn't a lot, guys. I keep telling you, this lady's pretty mysterious. Most of those other sources said that her death was unknown. They just don't know what happened to her. So I think I'm going to go with the 1987 death. That seems pretty likely. She would have been a lot older at that point, and it seems pretty reasonable that she probably would have died around that period. So we're going to go with that. So that wasn't the end of the story, though, because her case would leave a lasting effect on Japan. And the case was the prime reason the government actually decided to reconsider the legalization of abortion. Because there was such a large surge in unplanned infant births, and most people in that economy could not afford to pay for an unplanned child, let alone pay for themselves. On June 24th, 1949, abortion for economic reasons was legalized under the Eugenic protection law in Japan. Now, again, I'm not here to debate morality. I'm not going to give you any opinions that I have about this topic. I'm just telling you the facts. So leave me out of the debates, please and thank you. Anyways, so her case had a huge effect on Japan in legalizing abortion because they figured it was better to give parents options instead of forcing them to go to people like Miyuki who would take advantage of them and steal their money and kill their children. So that's why they legalized it. Now, for Miyuki's heartless and unfeeling manner in which she decided to let so many innocent babies die, she is our horrible human in history for the week. And like I said, this episode's a little shorter just because there is not a lot of information on this woman. She is an enigma. She is hard to nail down. I searched, guys. There's a lot of... I found articles, but they all have the exact same information or just slightly altered. Like, they have children. They don't have children. She died here. No, she didn't. Like, so I gave you all the information I was able to find, but because of the heartless way she killed those babies, she is our horrible human in history for the week. But join me next week as we go over another listener request from Jamie, and I'm excited for this one. It's a creepy story, and it's going to be really great because next week we are going to talk about a man who seemed like the average guy next door, you know, like your normal next door neighbor. He had a wife and a daughter that he adored and spoiled. He worked a normal 9-to-5 job, but deep down, he had an evil secret, and he kept it from his own family. They had no idea what was going on after they fell asleep at night. So, next week, be sure you tune in because we are going to be talking about the BTK killer. And we will be talking about all the evil things that this serial killer did. So, we will see you guys next week. Thanks for tuning in.